I'm really excited today to introduce David Best. Before I do, let me just turn it to Lori. Lori, is there anything you'd like to say by way of words of welcome or?
I don't think so. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. For those of you who hadn't joined us yesterday, welcome to the festivities. I see the numbers really clicking up now, so I see folks getting on. And I should say, for those of you who are not on the East Coast, but are in the US, thank you for getting up early with us.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to see you back here again today for our second day of our third JCOIN Steering Committee meeting, our second one that we're doing all virtual. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. David Best. He is coming to us from the UK today, so I guess that is an advantage of having this virtual platform, is that it makes these kinds of things a little bit easier. Dr. Best is a professor of criminology at the University of Derby and an honorary professor of regulation and global governance at the Australian National University. He is also the chair of the Prisons Research Network and of the British Society of Criminology. Dr. Best is a trained psychologist and criminologist, and he has worked in practice, research, and policy in addiction recovery and working with justice-involved populations throughout his career. He has lots of accomplishments. I won't go through them all, but he's edited 7 books and published more than 200 peer-reviewed articles, so has really contributed to the literature. And he's here today to talk about some of his work that's focused on recovery pathways, recovery capital and its measurement. He also does a lot of work around social identity theory and the implications of that for recovery. Lots of other work in this space focused on connections and all the social aspects of recovery. And I'm really excited to introduce David to talk today because I was introduced to him about a year ago by Susan Broderick. I don't know if anyone knows Susan, but she is a former Manhattan district attorney, and her own experience with recovery has made her really a creative thinker and connector of people. And so when Susan connected David and I, we started having conversations about some of his work. I found it very intriguing. It's changing the way I think about things, and I wanted to have him here today to talk to you all so you could hear these ideas and start bringing these ideas into your work and thinking about it. I think it has some really important implications for the work that JCOIN does as a network, and so that's why I'm very excited to have him here today. Please think of questions. We have some time here in this session, and really hope that we can have an open dialogue. You know, it's very, I wish we could all be in person so we could have a free-flowing exchange of ideas, but I hope we can get as close to that as possible on this platform. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David. I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. I think it'll be really fun. So David, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tisha, and thank you to you and your colleagues for inviting me. I will introduce myself as a fatigued midlifer, which is a category I'm quite happy to own. By way of introduction, I think Tisha's covered a lot of it. I guess I've done a lot of work in recovery over about 15 years or so. I think probably the thing that I would say is I come at this very much from a social psychology perspective. So what I will be inclined to say is really through that lens, and through the lens of what I think is fundamentally a strengths-based and a social perspective. One of the things I did want to say, and one of the questions I guess that some of you might have is, why would you want to measure capital or positive or strengths-based things? And I guess I'm going to go back 25 years now. I started work as a psychologist in the Maudsley Hospital, a big teaching hospital in southeast London, where our catchment population was around 4.5 million people in the South Thames area of London. I used to run a weekly brief assessment clinic. And I used to have to assess 6 people in a 3-hour window. And in that time, it was a mad dash rush to measure how many physical health problems, mental health problems, drug problems, alcohol problems, relationship problems, injecting problems, housing problems, crime problems each person had. It was an incredibly demoralizing, negative experience for me and for them. And at no point did we ever attempt to assess what was good about people, what they did well. And I guess for me, it always struck me as a massive omission. And the whole of the capital literature, I think, is part of a broader strengths-based movement in justice and in mental health and addictions that's really about trying to address that sense and create a new sense of balance. And I think very much in a similar tradition to restorative justice or therapeutic jurisprudence, the recovery movement is a fundamental shift in three core dimensions, from the specialist clinic to the community, from the individual to the collective, and from pathology or deficit to strengths. So that's where I'm coming from. One of the things when I speak to American audiences, I tend to start by saying is, you'll be astonished to hear that English is in fact my first language. I am Scottish. I have this appalling accent because my mother is from Glasgow and my father was from Belfast. So I've got this strange crossover of partly Northern Irish and partly Scottish. So one of the things we have decided in advance in this talk was, if people have clarification questions, or if you can't understand my stupid accent, then please ask them. But for more substantive topic-based questions, I'll probably talk for just under an hour or so, and then that'll leave us some time at the end for proper discussion. So next slide, please. Perfect. Thank you very much. Now, this is a shameless piece of self-advertising that's going on here. So if you don't, thank you. Thank you for whoever said my accent is perfect. My nearest and dearest wouldn't agree with you. Anyway, this is a shameless piece of marketing of two books I brought out last year. One was an edited volume on the right-hand side with my friend and colleague Charlotte Coleman from the University of Ghent in Belgium. The other, Pathways to Recovery and Desistance, it was a single authored book. And for me, it summarizes two core things. One, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, but also the very clear similarities of why people manage to overcome substance use problems and how people get out of criminal lifestyles and recidivistic lifestyles. And there are many, many common elements that are largely around social networks, social identities, and access to opportunity. And much of what I'm going to talk about is in those areas. So can I go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so I intend to basically cover four core questions today. What is recovery capital? How and why do we measure it? What do you do with the results? And where are we up to now with development work in this area? The last slide I have in my presentation is my contact details, and I'd certainly be absolutely delighted if people want to get in touch with me afterwards and to engage in further discussion about any of the ideas I've talked about today. So I hope that will be a possibility. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with some summary information that I guess some basic statistics, some of which are more contentious than others. I've deliberately not put a confidence interval around the recovery rate of 58%. And this is from the SAMHSA publication by Sheedy and Witter, which asserts that on an average from a range of studies, 58% of people who have a lifetime substance use disorder will eventually achieve lasting stable recovery. And stable recovery is typically defined as 5 years or more in complete remission. Why is that important? Well, the general estimates of relapse rates are in year one, the typical relapse rates are something between 50 and 60 or 50 and 70%. That diminishes to around 14% in year 5 and then largely plateaus off. And based on the great work done by Michael Dennis and his colleagues at Chestnut Health Systems, we can estimate that on average, addiction careers will last something in the region of 27 to 28 years, with 4 to 5 episodes of treatment over a window over 8 years in time. So it's a long journey for people. It's a long journey with the opportunity for multiple interventions and multiple opportunities for change. As I mentioned earlier, much of my early work was clinical research, and I worked in a methadone maintenance clinic, an inpatient alcohol detox ward, an inpatient heroin detox ward. And about 13 or 14 years ago, I started focusing much more on recovery. And for me, one of the most striking studies, and one of the things I think is crucially important for this discussion, is that the stopping process and the staying stop process are not the same thing. So when we did some work about 12 or 13 years ago in London, what typically was reported to us, that why people stopped was a tipping point or a turning point. There was a catalytic event. Something happened in people's lives that made them want to stop. And it was typically accompanied by a growing sense of tired of the lifestyle, had enough. But that the factors that enabled them beyond that point to remain abstinent and remain in recovery were not intrapsychic factors. They were fundamentally social factors. They were about moving away from using networks and moving into pro-social sober networks. And so the transition was a fundamentally social process, that process of sustaining recovery. And I think one of the things that people have struggled with about the whole recovery debate, and certainly in Australia and the UK, where the harm reduction movement is particularly politically powerful, there's been an assumption that it's an either-or question about harm reduction interventions or recovery interventions. And for me, the question I have tried to answer, and I've focused much of my research endeavour around, is what happens post-acute treatment. In other words, not almost being agnostic about what works in specialist treatments, to move to the question of, okay, once somebody has engaged or benefited in specialist treatment, what do they need to do next? How do they manage to sustain that process of change? And for me, this is much more related to the question of the accrual of strengths than the overcoming of deficits. And that applies not only at an individual level, but also at a programmatic level. So if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you will see that there is a reference to a paper by Leamy and colleagues, which was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry 9 years ago. And the paper was about mental health recovery, not about addiction recovery. And what they were attempting to do was identify common elements of programs. It was a systematic review. They were trying to identify common elements of programs that supported and sustained recovery endeavours. And they identified 5, which very fortuitously made up the acronym JCOIN. And that the 5 elements, and I think it's, chronologically, it's not far away from being in this order, that positive human connection, role modelling, access to a successful peer generates hope. And the hope in turn generates the motivation and the mechanism that allows what then becomes a potentially virtuous circle of change. And the only change in the order of the acronym, I would say from my research, would be I'd put meaning above identity. In other words, the hope generates the motivation and capacity to engage in meaningful activities. The meaningful activities people engage in, training, education, employment, generates a sense of empowerment, and also generates a positive sense of personal and social identity. And so those bottom 3 elements, the IME, becomes a virtuous circle of change. Next slide, please. Perfect. What is recovery capital? Next slide, please, again. I hope you're not going to get finger fatigue with all these changes of slides. Anyway, so what is recovery capital? Granfield and Cloud, who I guess may well be known to many of you, defined recovery capital as the breadth and depths of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to sustain recovery from alcohol and other drug problems. And much more optimistically and assertively, William White and William Cloud asserted in 2008 that stable recovery is best predicted on the basis of recovery assets, not pathologies. And that really is at the heart of this, of the processes I'm going to describe. And really, I guess, from about 2008, the language of recovery capital became very common in the addictions field. It became one of those things where people started to use this language as if they were talking about something quite relevant and important. And a lot of clients grasped onto this. So a lot of people in addiction services, recovery services, started utilizing the language, but it was elusive and it was hard to pin down. And next slide, please. And one of the things that became important for me was the sense of, well, what are we actually attempting to do here? And going back a number of years, I worked in a medical school in Birmingham in the English Midlands. I had an intercalating medical student called Louise Hibbert, who was interested in looking at addiction recovery. And so she went out and took a group of people in long-term recovery and gave them the WHO qual breath, which is a quality of life indicator of 26 or 27. I'm sure somebody will be able to tell me exactly. It measures four domains that are hugely relevant to the recovery concept, and I think are particularly important for the recovery concept. Physical quality of life, psychological quality of life, so much so obvious. Social quality of life and environmental quality of life. Now, she interviewed these people in long-term recovery. She came back and we looked at the results, and both of us kind of shook our heads and thought, we've done something wrong with the statistics. Because compared to population norms, in two of the dimensions, social quality of life and environmental quality of life, and environmental quality of life really means how comfortable, safe, and fitting in do you feel in your neighborhood. The people in long-term recovery were statistically significantly higher on average than people who'd never been addicted in the first place. And it germinated two thoughts in my head. One is that recovery is not about returning to some kind of homeostatic zero, that we can start talking about this thing as a better than well phenomenon. People don't return to a neutral state. And in that sense, the word recovery is perhaps slightly misleading, because what in fact is happening is a process of ongoing personal growth. And the second aspect of this that I thought was really, really important was that the focus is on fundamentally interpersonal dimensions, the areas that the individuals exceeded the general population were about social networks and lived environment. And Phil Valentine, around the same time, described a similar effect for cocaine users, and he termed this better than well. In a book I did in 2014, I interviewed a whole group of people who worked in the drug and alcohol field, but had their own lived experience. Yes, they will, as far as I'm concerned. I'm afraid I'm too nosy to ignore questions as they pop up on the screen, so I'm going to kind of try and answer as they go along. At least from my point of view, I'm more than happy for the slides to be shared. So if Tisha and Laurie aren't able to share them straight away, just email me and I'll send them to you. Anyway, so
we will make it happen.
Perfect, thank you. So I did some work where I interviewed some people in long-term recovery who were working in the field, and I found exactly the same effect. In the same areas, social and environmental quality of life, they reported mean scores in excess of the expected scores for the general population. This is what we mean by the better than well scale. Next slide, please. The next slide is a bit more visually interesting. It's an infographic. And this is based on a series of surveys that have been done with people in recovery in various places in the world. So this is one that was done in the UK, and there have been others in Canada. The first one was by Faces and Voices of Recovery in America. They've been done in Australia, South Africa, and most recently, which I'll probably come back to towards the end, in the Balkan countries. And I've started adapting the Life in Recovery survey to develop a new kind of recovery capital measure called SABRS, the Strengths and Barriers Recovery Scale, but possibly more of that anon. What I wanted to comment on here was that on the right-hand side of this slide, you will see that there are diagonal boxes, one of which says 74% of people in long-term recovery have remained steadily employed during their recovery. So this obviously is a massive change and a massive indication. The top right-hand box, 79.4% of people in long-term recovery have volunteered since beginning their recovery journey. Okay, so I went away and had a little look at what the typical rate of volunteering is in the UK. And the typical rate of volunteering in the UK is 39%. In other words, people in long-term recovery are twice as likely to volunteer in their local communities as people who've never been addicted in the first place. And this is part of the same social environmental phenomenon, I think, as the better than well phenomenon. Okay, next slide, please. And from this, I started thinking and discussing with people how we could start making sense of something that was clearly, fundamentally and intrinsically different from the traditional measures. Many, many years ago, I was involved in the development of a standard clinical addiction research instrument called the Maudsley Addiction Profile, or the MAP, which did all the usual stuff. But I wanted to start measuring something fundamentally different. So the first attempt at quantification was a very short concept piece for the Royal Society for the Arts here in the UK, which I did with a person who may be known to many of you called Alexandra Lodi, who was a French-American recovery researcher based in New York. And based on studies that we had done previously, our first attempt at quantification, which isn't the one used by Granfield and Cloud, incidentally, who went for a fourfold split on what recovery capital is. And we decided on, based on the evidence we'd accumulated in our respective studies, we went for a threefold split of personal, social, and collective, or which I now refer to as community recovery capital. And it's really important because in my head, the notion of recovery capital is those complicated personal factors that people need to grow over time: resilience, communication skills, coping skills, self-esteem, self-efficacy. They grow as a consequence of scaffolding provided by the other two factors, by social support and engagement in pro-social social activities and access to resources and lived communities. They create the scaffolding around an individual that over that 5-year window of change allows people to grow recovery capital. Okay, next slide, please. And one of the two studies that this was based in is we refer to as the Goya study. Goya as in the Spanish artist Francisco Goya. And I'll explain why later. So again, we were looking at kind of what generates, what is associated with elevated levels of quality of life in recovery. And there was a clear social effect. It didn't really matter, paradoxically, how much time you spend with non-addicts, but the more time you spent with other people in recovery, the better your quality of life was. That was factor one in our study. The second factor was when we just did a simple count of meaningful pro-social activities: parenting, community group involvement, volunteering, education or training, and employment. That was the single biggest predictor. The sum total of those 5 things in hours in the previous week was the biggest predictor. Now, Goya is an incredibly sophisticated scientific term that stands for get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. The more, and for me, this is the link between connection and meaningful activity in JCOIN. That positive social connection with other people in recovery is a catalyst for change. Now, I realize some of you are probably dissatisfied with the level of detail of science so far, so the next slide is an attempt to address that. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is a structured equation model that is in one of the papers I'll refer to later. For people like me who are more interested in the ideas than the data, I'll give you a very quick overview of how to read this slide. So let me just put it in context first. Previous slide referred to studies done in Glasgow and Birmingham around 10 or 11 years ago. This paper refers to a study done with recovery residences in Florida a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, I think the data was collected. And what it shows is there are 2 pathways to positive well-being. There's the traditional pathway of diminishing barriers, diminishing unmet needs, that kind of traditional therapeutic model of we identify all your pathologies, risk factors, and we attempt to address them. The second one is exactly the same effect we found in the Birmingham and Glasgow Goya studies, which is the more meaningful activity, the longer you're in recovery residences, and the more meaningful activities you engage in, the more both your personal and your social recovery capital grows, and it creates a positive strength-based pathway into well-being. And so all of our 5 well-being factors: psychological health, physical health, quality of life, quality of accommodation, and support network. So the underlying hypothesis here is that positive human connection generates a sense of hope, which generates meaningful activity, which has dynamic and positive impact in those other areas. Okay, so we're getting closer to the question of, that's all very well, but what are you actually counting? If we could go to the next slide, please. Perfect. So how do we measure recovery capital? Next slide, please, again. When William White started writing about recovery capital, at the end of his monographs, and I'm afraid one of the things that will become entirely apparent to you over the course of this presentation is I have no original ideas whatsoever. I steal other people's ideas throughout my career in a kind of magpie fashion. Anyway, so William White monographs, I think it's the 2008 or 2009 Peer-Based Recovery Support Services monograph, has a checklist of what effectively amounts to kind of recovery capital measure. So after discussions with him, we partnered up with a statistician and addiction researcher from the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction called Teodora Grishkova, and we developed 2 scales. In 2011, we developed the Recovery Group Participation Scale, and this was kind of a measure of community recovery capital. And then the following year, we developed what's called the Assessment of Recovery Capital. And the Assessment Recovery Capital was the first of these scales that we developed meaningful psychometrics for. So the original version of the Assessment of Recovery Capital was 100 items long. It had 50 strengths measures, and it had 50 deficits or pathology measures. But in the majority of services that we attempted to implement it with, they said, we already measure all these deficit things with our numerous assessment intake scales. We do all that stuff. We don't want that. We just want the strengths-based measure. There is, however, one long-standing treatment service in England, residential treatment service, a front-end rehab called Clouds House in the southwest of England. And they have been using the 100-item version of the ARC for about 10 years now. And they would say that they consistently get a very clear pattern of change. And this is one of the areas that I'm currently working on, is the analysis of some of their data. That on entering treatment, you will get a very rapid reduction in pathology measures, but there's a much slower increase in strength measures. So one is not simply the converse or the inverse of the other. As one will diminish, the barriers will diminish prior to the growth of strengths. One of the things about the Assessment of Recovery Capital that has been questioned on quite a few occasions is that the way we designed it, we deliberately wanted it to be not even a yes-no question. So it's not a Likert scale. It's simply a single box to check if you unequivocally endorse that feeling at the time you're filling in the questionnaire. Now, the reason for doing that was I wanted it to be only checked if a person clearly endorsed that feeling at that moment in time. It's a point in time assessment. It doesn't attempt to reflect how people feel over 30 days or 90 days. It's a point in time assessment. And the architecture of the Assessment of Recovery Capital is that it's 50 items, 25 personal recovery capital, PRC, 25 social recovery capital, SRC. Each of those 25 items is split into 5 subscales. So for clinical purposes, this is really important. So there are effectively 10 subdomains of 5 items each, and we would look at changing all of those things as part of a kind of clinical application. Corey Vilsaint, who I think was a PhD student at the time when she did this. Ah, Laurie is nodding, so yeah, good. I'm glad I got confirmation there. Developed the brief version of the assessment of recovery capital, which with an astonishing leap of imagination she called the BARC, the Brief Assessment Recovery Capital Scale, which is 10 items. And what's interesting there is that the decision was taken not to go with the endorse or not. So that is a Likert scale-based measurement. And I guess for many research purposes, the BARC may well be something that people would choose to use because it's brief and simple and quick to fill in. My argument would be that if you're involved in more clinical research, the assessment of recovery capital gives you an awful lot more richness to gather the data and feed that back, and I'll certainly come on to that as we move forward. Next slide, please. So we've had significant success and interest with the assessment of recovery capital. But one of the concerns was it was a paper and pencil scale. For clinical purposes, it was too slow to get the results. It's too complicated to do the calculations of the subscales for clinicians in busy clinical settings. People didn't know what to do with the findings. What do we do with the strengths they identified? They felt it felt like a research tool. And the other one quite clearly is that it doesn't attempt to, and it doesn't address adequately community recovery capital. So it's personal and social are the two core scales. And the argument for us was, well, use it in conjunction with the recovery group participation scale, and that would give you a 64-item range of measures. But I think there's some concern. So in response to this, we then switched to the idea of saying, okay, how do we now attempt going about creating a scale that does two things, which is both to measure recovery capital and then utilize it to potentially work with a client, work with somebody in recovery, but where they go next. Next slide, please. And the rationale for the RECCAP is really about saying, okay, well, it's about part of a recovery and treatment review process. So I'll talk about the psychometrics a little bit later. There's a short assessment of, so sorry, I should take a step back. The RECCAP is effectively a compendium of established psychometric measures. So it consists of a number of different scales, which I'll list shortly. But it starts with a short measure of overall functioning that's linked to a UK indicator called the Treatment Outcome Profile that was developed by John Marsden and colleagues at the Institute of Psychiatry in London and has been tested and applied by Ryan and colleagues in Australia. And what it does is that starts to give you a brief measure of some core deficits and some core areas of concern. The aim of the RECCAP was to provide an overall client profile, and it fitted with the UK notion of something that should be utilised on a quarterly cycle. In other words, the client should complete this survey, they should plan for the next 3 months, and so that's repeated 4 times over the course of a year. And it links very much to the notion of recovery care planning. Next slide, please. Yeah, and at the heart of this idea was the notion of a pivot. The pivot is basically the transition point from the completion of the instrument to the provision of a score profile and what do you do with it. And for me, I was very conscious of the fact that the aim was to translate the ARC, which remains the basic kind of research measure, into something that was much more engaging. From a recovery perspective, I think the philosophy of recovery is it has to be much more interactive and engaging and have benefit for the participant. So the whole point of this was then to say, could we work to develop something that the feedback was instant and could be utilised to provide an individual with a score so that the recovery coach or navigator could make sense of it, and then it could be fed back to the individual. I'm just conscious that once again, I'm flapping my gums far too much and I'm taking far too long over every slide, so I need to speed up a little bit. So next slide, please. Fundamental model is called MPE, Measure, Plan, Engage. The aim of the measurement notion is use a systematic assessment of recovery resources as well as barriers and unmet needs to create an evidence-based profile of recovery capital to guide future actions in the next steps of the recovery journey. Next slide, please. Well, as I said, then you have this pivot, the pivot to a plan. And the plan is really about saying, how do we translate the recovery resources into an action planning model based on the principles of node link mapping? And I believe one of the people on the call is Dr. Kevin Knight from Texas Christian University Institute of Behavioral Research, whose colleagues guided me and trained me in this wonderful method and technique many, many years ago. Kevin, I think that was sometime in the late 17th century, but I'm not entirely sure when it was. Okay, next slide. And then we move on to engage. So the whole point of this is the notion of inaction. So having planned, the individual then actively engages with community. And I currently have a PhD student, Beth Collinson, who's doing some amazing work around saying, for people who lack social support and people who lack access to pro-social resources in the community, how do we create a model for effective pathways and gateways into pro-social resources? And the engage part is crucial in this big picture. As I said, this is a social-psychological model of effective pro-social community engagement. And one of the things that I remember from my own time working in specialist treatment services was that horrible sense of an island. And the engage part is absolutely crucial. Why is it absolutely crucial? Next slide, please. Yes, this is a very, very old study from 1981, in fact, and is a really simple, basic level lesson about effective engagement. 20 people attended an alcohol outpatient clinic, randomly assigned to one of two conditions. 10 got the standard model of a leaflet to actively encourage them to attend a 12-step group. The other 10, the alcohol counsellor handed them the phone, dialed up the local AA office and told them to make an appointment there and then. When they were given the leaflet condition, attendance was 0 out of 10. When they were given the assertive condition, the attendance was 10 out of 10. All right, next slide, please. We decided to replicate a study from the States from Timko and colleagues. When I worked at the Maudsley, we had an emergency admissions ward called the Acute Assessment Unit. My colleague Victoria Manning led this study. And basically, the Acute Assessment Unit was a clean-up and chuck-out unit. It was a 10-day admissions ward for people injecting in their necks, injecting in their groins, who were fitting, real kind of emergency cases. Our aim in this study was to get people to, in their 10 days on the ward, to attend at least one hospital meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, or Narcotics Anonymous. We randomly assigned 153 people to one of three conditions. The first, as in the previous study, basically just got a leaflet telling them about where all the meetings were across the hospital over the course of the week. The second condition, the booking in doctor actively encouraged them to attend a meeting. And in the third condition, a peer came and took them to a meeting. The results from this study, in the peer support condition, which we refer to as the assertive linkage condition, there was more meeting attendance on the ward, there was more meeting attendance in the 3 months after departure from the ward, and there was reduced substance use in the 3 months after departure from the ward. What are the lessons from this study? Giving people a leaflet is the pointless abuse of dead trees. Apologies to any medics in the room, but referrals from a medic are only mildly more useful than dead trees. And really only in the assertive peer-based condition did we get an effective level of engagement. And this for me is crucial, because the process of recovery and the measurement of recovery capital is fundamentally about the process of effective community engagement, particularly for those whose social networks and families consist only of other people involved in recidivistic activities and substance use. Next slide, please. And I'm going to give you a very quick example of this from my work in Sheffield. And I'll just move on very quickly after this. So we got a grant from the Health Foundation in the UK with a myriad of partners across this slide to train people up to become community connectors. And our aim was to say, could we open doors across the city of Sheffield, a post-industrial city in the north of England, to engage people in recovery processes. Next slide, please. And I'd like to thank you again, Lindsay, for your incredibly efficient button pressing on the next slide thing, which is very good. Thanks. So we wanted to get people engaged in 4 different types of activity: 12-step mutual aid groups, local recreation and sport, volunteering, education, employment, peer and community recovery groups. Okay, so we trained up 21 people who themselves were in long-term recovery, and their aim was to, over the course of around 3 months, to open doors. Next slide, please. And in spite of all the concerns about stigma and exclusion, 134 community assets were identified and positive, meaningful pathways to support were created. Why is this important in a talk about measure and recovery capital? Why this is important is, back to this point, to build personal recovery capital in my model, in my world, requires 2 different things: positive pro-social networks and access to community resources. This isn't a model about the magic dust of psychosocial interventions or pharmacotherapies. It's about effective use of social groups and pro-social community assets to enable people to change over time. And so this is all about the engaged component. Okay, I'm now going to take a step back and go back to talking about the measurement processes. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The RECAP assessment. As I mentioned, the assessment is based, so I should thank the Recovery Outcomes Institute in Florida for their work here on helping me to develop this as an online instrument. So essentially, the purpose of the RECAP was to switch from a paper and pencil based test with all the problems of immediacy of feedback to either online or even if offline, computerized and done on a phone or on an iPad to allow immediate scoring and immediate feedback of results. And the point of this, as soon as the assessment, the RECAP assessment is completed, the individual gets the kind of profile you see on the phone in the image in the top left corner. And essentially it's a traffic lighted system. So as you see in the bottom left diagram, the traffic light system basically identifies strengths as in green, neutral areas as in amber, and risks and deficits as in red. Next slide, please. And the key to this model is about how do we identify and map changes over time? How do we measure? The assessment of recovery capital in this slide is identified at the bottom in the Manhattan skyline at the bottom, where basically it provides that very rapid model. So the 10 subdomains of the ARC are each characterized by a red, amber, or a green box. Now, the rationale and the logic of this is not a deficits-based model. So you use strengths to build strengths. So the starting point from this model would be you utilize those things in green to help build those things in amber and red. Next slide. Oh, sorry, before I go on to the next slide. On the left, sorry, Lindsay, can you use a second finger to go back one because I moved far too quickly there. Perfect. Right. So on the left-hand side is basically, I said the RECAP was a compendium instrument. The left-hand side bullets are basically a summary of each of those core measures contained within the RECAP. So essentially, we have initial areas that look at overall well-being and quality of life, barriers, unmet needs and service involvement, and then we move on to assessment of recovery capital, recovery group participation, outside social support and commitment to sobriety. The typical completion time for the RECAP is 12 to 15 minutes. The time taken is much more variable about how long the feedback and care planning process takes after that. So that's what a one-off assessment would look like. If we move to the next slide, please, which you've had a tantalizing glimpse of already. the purpose is also to allow change over time measurement. And you can see that the use of line graphs rather than bar graphs is the way of characterizing areas that have deteriorated and areas that have improved over time. Okay, so essentially what we have here is the different domains, and you can see across the top, if your eyesight is really good, the 4 areas of personal, social, recovery, participation, and barriers and needs, each with indicators of change. So there's a quantification for each of those measures that allows us, there's a single quantification, single score for each of those measures that allows us to sum up and summarize the individual's performance on those indicators. Next slide, please. With one of my colleagues 3 years ago, we summarized the basic psychometrics in a paper published in Drug and Alcohol Dependence, based on data from 546 residents in one of 8 recovery residences in Florida. There was an acceptable fit for each of the dimensions, and it's important to say there are at present no published data on predictive validity, though we're working on change measurements, as I'll mention towards the end. As I said, the model that we identified slide was that a pathway to recovery capital typically involves greater amount of time in residence, entirely in keeping with the literature. But from our point of view, there was also a key mediating role of meaningful activities in this relationship. And that creates 2 different pathways and models, as I previously mentioned. Okay, so to move on to the next slide, the next area is what do you do with the results and what do the results mean? I'm going to go, because I'm running slightly over time, I'm going to go slightly faster through this section because this really is much more about the clinical application of this. So really the aim of this is to say, how do you do what's intrinsic to all ideas of recovery, and particularly from the mental health recovery field, the notion that recovery is a very individualized and personalized process. And how do you attempt to reconcile that with creating standardized measures of recovery resources and recovery capital? Well, our way has basically been to try and say, we personalize the application of the scores so that what happens next is based on the translation of the scores to a personalized recovery care plan. And if we can move, so we go for SMART objectives. Can we move on, please? Sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, perfect. And essentially that's utilised to help the individual develop recovery management skills, develop strong connections. The aim here is effectively to build those zones of capital that are currently lacking based on the skill profile the individual has. Next slide, please. And through the process is very much one of a socially mediated change process. Next slide, please. And I'm literally just going to flick through these next slides quickly because I'm sure many of you know how node link mapping works. Next slide, please. The purpose of mapping is really, for me, is crucial. And I think this is true whether you're a researcher who wants to do repeated measures research, or whether you're a clinician, that the mechanism of data collection that's inherent in the whole recovery capital process is it has to be shared and it has to be interactive. It creates a shared and living record, and for those involved in coaching or recovery navigating relationships, it's a mechanism for building trust. The whole process of data collection should not be a disempowering relationship where I get you to fill in a questionnaire, I take the question away, and you know nothing more about it. Who knows what inferences I'm drawing about you after I've filled in that questionnaire. So the part of the aim of this is a philosophical aim, is about ensuring that the process of data collection and data ownership is shared. So the notion of mapping, it fits incredibly well. The visualization process fits incredibly well with an empowerment model of recovery. And that seems to me to be incumbent on research in recovery as much as it is in clinical processes around recovery. Nonetheless, it will also improve communication, improve recall and recollection, increase motivation and commitment, build on success, and provide a means of getting unstuck as the process moves forward. The next 1 to 4 slides are really all just examples of maps that will be in the pack. Next slide, please. And again, and again, And again. So it looked like there were a lot of slides left. There's not really, because we're now getting through this. And what this allows you to do, by the time you get to here, is effectively what you're trying to do is to reconcile the individual's personal objectives and goals with the utilisation of strengths identified in the REC cap. So the aim there is very much to treat this as a model of implementation and activation. And next slide, please. So you utilise this as a way of saying, okay, how do we use recovery capital scores and profiles to identify what goals have been met and particularly what routes and mechanisms are being used to measure this process. Okay, next slide, please. So that's an overview of the tool, its measurement, and its kind of philosophical implementation rationale. The last section I'm going to talk about over the course of the next 5 to 10 minutes or so is to talk a little bit about what we have done with the REC cap and where we are currently up to. So if I can go to the next slide, please. Although it may not look like it, this is HMP Home House. HMP Home House is a local prison in the northeast of England. I'm now going to say something very politically inappropriate and incorrect. So this was the first designated recovery prison in the UK, in Stockton-on-Tees, in a very industrially deprived part of England. Why do we have a recovery prison in the UK? Well, it came about entirely by accident. The government minister at the time, the prisons minister, was doing a press briefing. And in a wave of energy and enthusiasm, she said, we're going to have a drug-free prison in the UK within the next year. At which point a senior civil servant pulled her to one side and said, excuse me, ma'am, I'm afraid there's 2 conditions required for a drug-free prison. 1, no prisoners, and 2, no staff. So quickly there had to be a follow-up press release saying what we really meant was a recovery prison. So recovery prison. So HMP Home House is the first recovery prison. And I was very fortunate that the REC cap was embedded within the set of instrumentation for use in HMP Home House during the 2-year pilot process. If we can go to the next slide, please. Just to give you some indication of what the drug recovery prison is, the first part of this is taken, well, actually all of this is taken from the MOJ as the Ministry of Justice in the UK. In 2017, HMP Home House was chosen to pilot the concept of a drug recovery prison programme, which will run until 2020. An investment of £9 million has been provided by the Ministry of Justice and the Department of Health and Social Care to support this Pathfinder process. The objective of the drug recovery programme is to test a whole prison approach that promotes recovery by tackling both the supply and demand for drugs in prison, by creating an environment where opportunities for recovery can flourish and everyone benefits. Key elements include promoting safety and security, enhancing care and well-being, making the prison a more positive experience, and strengthening continuity of care after release. And now all of you know that I can read, which is great news for everyone concerned. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So what do we have here? Well, what we have here is a place where, I don't know what the situation is like in the US. It's not possible to do online surveying in British prisons. There's internet bans and blocks in all the prisons, and with COVID, there's now a gradual move to intranet to allow internal communications, but it's been very slow and it's very painful. What we did, and one of the things I think that's important to say about the REC cap, is we trained 3 populations of people to administer it. We trained peer mentors, so we trained a number of prisoners, trusted senior prisoners, to be administrators of the REC cap. We trained healthcare staff and we trained prison officers. So peer application is entirely possible, and we had no difficulties at all in training in either with the paper and pencil version or the online version. We had no problem at all. And the whole point of this was, the moment the last button gets clicked, the person gets the kind of profiles that we've got here. And we had some issues with implementation, but they were largely technological issues to do with the prison. and we are slowly starting to analyse what the results from this process are, and we're getting some encouraging positive results. Next slide, please. So what do the initial data indicate? Within the first 3 months of entering a recovery prison, you do get marked reductions in unmet service needs and barriers to recovery, and you do get improvements in personal and social recovery capital, recovery group engagement, and quality of life. I'm not sure what it's like for a US researcher working with prisons. In the UK, it's slightly frustrating for me that I can't give you more detailed information on the results from this, but the process for MOJ, Ministry of Justice clearance, and publication of results in peer-reviewed journals is a very slow one and a complicated one. So we have some really encouraging results from Home House, but we're just not in a position to publish it yet. One of the things that was really interesting about this was it really took about 2 years for effective culture change to allow us to maximise the use of this instrument. And in fact, it was really healthcare staff and peers who embraced this most successfully to start with real difficulties getting prison officers, most of whom now have personal mentorship roles with some prisoners to engage with this to start with. Next slide, please. I continue my work in partnership with recovery residences in Florida, and I've been delighted to say I've been working with a PhD student from the University of Stockholm in Sweden called Sophia Hard, who's been working with me on developing, on doing some analysis in this. And what we found was, we found a couple of really interesting things, and this is just about to go to journal publication. Not journal publication, journal submission. There's a big gap between journal submission and journal publication. So we're just about to go to journal submission with this paper. What we found was that overall initial retention in recovery residents was pretty poor. But for the people who were retained, recovery capital does increase over the first 6 months. Increases in recovery capital were associated entirely fitting with our previous work, with engaging in meaningful activities, particularly employment, greater social support, and greater recovery group participation. An interesting, kind of unusual finding we found was that younger people and female residents were more likely to leave prematurely from recovery residence, but when they were retained, they showed a much better positive recovery capital trajectory than older participants, and particularly older men in recovery residence. Next slide, please. I'm going to have a go at this, and I'm not sure entirely how well this is going to go for me, but I'm going to try and read you the top part. This is from Kite mea kataka te kakano te wahi I tika ana ka tenaku a ka pihi ake hitipu hu. If a seed falls in the right place, it will germinate and a new seedling will sprout. I have a fabulous partnership with Odyssey House in Auckland in New Zealand. And we are working on exactly that model of RECCAP implementation. One of the, so in 3 different services, all residential, we have, all residential, we're likely to add a prison to this shortly. The RECCAP is being administered as routine practice, and we're supplementing it with 2 of those other things that I mentioned. We're using social identity mapping as a way of identifying what kind of social networks people have and where they have social isolation. And we're using asset-based community engagement techniques to work out how to create that bridge. One of the things I think that, compared with the desistance from crime literature, is a gap and a limitation in the recovery literature, is that there's very little cultural or national comparisons of recovery capital pathways. So part of the Odyssey House project is we're working with the cultural advisor from the drug court in Maori, in Auckland, to develop a Maori specific version of the RECCAP. And in New Zealand at the moment, that's kind of complicated and politicised. Because there's a debate going on about whether it's appropriate for people from white backgrounds to be involved at all in the development of Maori measurement instruments. So it's a complicated issue, but we are currently trying to at least partly address that question of cultural specificity. There are a couple of other projects going on here in the UK that are standard treatment service and recovery service implementation projects. I didn't do too bad at sticking to my time. It's only 2 or 3 minutes past 3, I think, 10. So I think I'll stop there and take on any questions or feedback. And as I said right at the start, I hope there'll be some discussion now, but here are my contact details if anyone wants to get in touch with me after today's seminar. So thank you all very much for your time and your attention.
Thank you, David. That was great. We do have a couple of questions in the question box. So Cameron, if you could help with unmuting Thomas Grabluski, and I'm sorry, Thomas, if I butchered how your last name is pronounced. You should be able to unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Oh, hi, David. Thank you so much for that great presentation. My question was, do you know of any studies which compare and contrast the effects of paid employment versus volunteering time on the building of recovery capital, and speaking specifically about the justice-involved populations?
Yeah. The blunt answer to your question about do I know any studies, no. I know an awful lot of anecdotal evidence from volunteers that people would say there's a real frustration and diminution value and self-efficacy of people who volunteer for long periods of time without there being meaningful pathways to employment. But I think there might be in relation to the desistance literature, where I think there's a much clearer literature. We do the desistance from crime literature. Thomas, if you drop me your email address, I will find a couple of those references and send them to you. And I'm afraid I'm going to cheat. I'm going to ask other people to help me find those references, because I'm pretty sure there's something specific about paid employment, at least as far as reducing recidivism from offending.
Thank you.
So we also have a question from Stephen Belenko. So Stephen, if we can go to you. Steve, you are still
sorry.
muted.
Okay, sorry. I don't. Tisha. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Stephen. And it's, I think we met nearly a year or so ago at NADCP.
Yeah, a little over a year ago. Yeah, I love your work. So this was really great. My question is about when you're describing the rec cap. At times, it sounded to me like a more of a clinical tool with coach or counselor feedback to, work collaboratively with the client and their recovery, but at times as a more of an assessment data collection tool that maybe be used to predict recovery pathways and development of recovery capital. Do you see it serving both functions, and are there any issues with it serving both functions?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And the evolution of it was quite deliberately an attempt to address specifically that point. The assessment of recovery capital, which is embedded in the REC cap and is the 50-item scale, we received a lot of criticism and feedback from treatment services basically saying, it's okay, but we've no idea what they have to do with it. It looks too much like a research tool. And because a lot of my work is applied action research, I wanted to try and do something to say, well, I want to address an omission in the range of domains measured. So one of the things we added was John Kelly's commitment to sobriety scale. But what I also wanted to make it much, much more accessible. And for me, this is like an ethical issue for research as well, so that there was clear, but irrespective of whether it was used clinically or not, or in a kind of therapeutic context, that the client could get instant results and instant feedback and could utilize it to support their ongoing recovery process. So for me, to the question that you at least in the UK, you always get asked in ethics forums is, what benefit is there to the clients from participating in this study? Well, it's ownership of knowledge and access to our materials around what possibly they might choose to do next in their recovery journey. So a great question, Steve. Does it create complications at times? Yes, it does. Yes, it does, because quite deliberately for me, it's not meant to be a straight research tool now.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go to Shelley Sue for the next question.
Am I unmuted now? I think okay. So my question had to do with how stigma plays a role in the community for accepting people with who are in recovery, and also for the person who is in recovery, self-stigma issues and sort of their motivation to engage, especially for JCOIN, as our populations are sort of experiencing double stigma of incarceration and substance use disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a PhD student in Melbourne, Monash University, called Melinda Beckwith, who added a self-stigma measure into the RECCAP as part of her data collection process. This was as part of an Australian Research Council funded grant called SONAR, Social Networks in Recovery. And as Tisha mentioned right at the start, one of the big aspects of this for me is about the role of social identity and change in recovery processes. Now, for me, how do you characterize stigma within a recovery capital framework? Cloud and Granfield produced a paper in 2008 on negative recovery capital. And stigma is a very core aspect of negative community recovery capital. And I've written a paper with a guy called Michael Savage on exactly that topic. An interesting way of measuring that, and I think there's two ways of measuring that, is perceived impact of stigma and self-stigmatization. Because certainly from a criminal justice perspective, you've got that internalization of stigmatized labels as a barrier to all of those things around how do you, the transition from connectedness and hope to engaging in meaningful activity. In two senses. One, I think there's a very practical, almost structural sense of you don't have access to resources like jobs and college courses and decent houses. But the second, much more subtle way that manifests itself, and we certainly see this in home house, is people would say, I'm not willing to put myself forward for these things because they're not for the likes of me and I won't get anywhere with them. So I think that work in Melbourne is still ongoing, but it strikes me that if you start including that concept of negative recovery capital, and then the notion of and there are a number of very good measures of self-stigmatization that fit perfectly. One of the core things about the RECCAP is it's modular, and you've got that constant researcher payoff of saying, well, we could add a whole range of other things, but it just becomes unwieldy and far too long. But for me, it was always meant to be the idea that people would add their own instruments, as Melinda did with her PhD, to say, there's something I want to measure with or against the RECCAP instrument. And so I'll add additional modules into it. There's no issue with that at all.
So I think we'll go to a question from Ashley Shadow next. And then I know you all can't see who's in the queue, but we're going to go from Ashley to Jody Rich to Angela Hageman. And I apologize to anyone whose name I butcher. And then Faye. So just so you know, we've got a line of questions, but please keep entering your questions and we will go in the order that they're received. So Ashley, you're up. But you have to unmute yourself first.
All right, thank you. And it's actually Shado. And great and also entertaining presentation, but very interesting information. I'm curious if you have looked at those recovery capital factors to see if they differ for emerging adults versus more mature adults in your samples.
Yeah, now I'm really pleased to say that I have one colleague in Australia called Emily Mawson, who has done some pilot work in this area with YSAS, the youth services in Melbourne. But more currently and up to date, Emily Hennessy from the University of Connecticut, I think, is currently doing some work with NADCP on this subject. So she is looking at, and Susan Broderick, who Tisha mentioned right at the start, is also involved in this project. So we had a discussion last week about the application of recovery capital measures to young people. You know, it seems to me that this question of multiple populations and application to multiple populations is critical, but has been very poorly addressed so far. It's still very early days for us. Emily Hennessy, who also produced a narrative review of the literature on recovery capital, which I would commend to anyone. If you're looking for a starting place to do a bit of reading about the science around recovery capital, please start with Emily Hennessy's review paper. And if anyone needs the reference, just email me and ask me about it. But in partnership with NADCP, they're looking to start doing some research work, gathering data in this area. One of the big things for me is we're still at a relatively early stage, so the notion of even adult norms is still early on. So, you know, it looks to me like there are clear gender differences in recovery capital patterns and pathways, as would fit with what we know about recovery literature. So the issues about unresolved psychological mental health problems in women during recovery. You know, there are things, but we're still at a relatively early age about establishing adequate and robust norms.
Great, thank you, David. Let's go to Angela next, or I'm sorry, Jody next, and then Angela.
Thanks, Tisha. This was really a great talk and a lot of food for thought. You know, there's a lot of anti-medication stigma, particularly for methadone, but also buprenorphine and a little bit naltrexone in the U.S. And I'm just wondering what your take is on, you know, how do you explain to people the role of these medications in relation to recovery?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. As I'm sure you're aware, it's one of those, it strikes me as one of those incredibly painful disputes that the addiction recovery field has completely failed to learn from the lessons from the mental health recovery movement 10 or 20 years ago, where they continued with this debate about the necessity of cessation of medication as a core part of recovery journeys. And the consensus quickly arose in the mental health field to say, look, you know, recovery is about a personalised process of global well-being and health. And both Betty Ford and UK Drug Policy Commission have recognised that there'll be variations in exactly what controlled use or abstinence means. In my own experience, my own work, in Home House, we administered the REC cap to people who were on Suboxone, on methadone. There is no, for me, there's no obvious reason why a recovery pathway wouldn't include people who were on prescribed medication that adhere to it. For me, the notion of measuring global health, well-being, and positive change isn't one that's to do with a kind of political position on medications.
You know, when I talk to patients, I always tell them what they need is recovery, and I go through what that's about. And I don't mention medications. And then at the end, I come and say, well, what the medications can do is take that monster off your back and give you the breathing room to actually work on your recovery. And so if you work it, you're going to get into recovery. If you don't, stop the medications, you're going to relapse.
And, you know, in some ways, it seems to me like possibly the most important group at all for applying a REC cap model or recovery capital model is with people on substitute prescriptions. I mean, I spent a number of years based in a methadone maintenance clinic in South London, and we had around 400 people on methadone maintenance prescriptions, about 150 of them on daily on-site pickups from the pharmacy. One of the huge challenges there is stasis. You know, people just get bogged down and don't make progress in many of those domains. And it seems to me that for people on substitute prescriptions, particularly not time-limited substitute prescriptions, the whole notion of using recovery capital monitoring, measurement, and recovery capital care planning is really about saying, how do you generate positive changes, not around the medication, but around some of those core areas of family relationships, housing and safety, meaningful activities and employment, social networks, engagement in community groups and recovery groups. So I couldn't agree with you more, Jodie. This seems to me an absolutely critical area, and there's nothing logical that says recovery capital measurement has to be restricted to people who are completely abstinent.
Great. Let's go to Angela next.
Hello, thank you so much. This has been so helpful, and I've been citing you for quite some time. I'm completing a dissertation and working with some folks here in Central Appalachia of the US, and we're really curious about, I'm curious about the role that peers play in building recovery capital. And in the literature, there's a good bit of literature around how the efficacy of peers in mental health, far less literature on the role that they play within sort of recovery ecosystems and how peers, and so I'm trying to think through measuring the role of peers in building recovery capital and moving across these recovery ecosystems. So just curious about your thoughts on that.
Look, I mean, the whole idea of recovery contagion is based, I think, on two conceptual frameworks. One is the Christakis and Fowler work on the Framingham Heart study about social contagion of behaviours, where effective positive role modelling creates social contagions of everything from obesity, heart disease, through to divorce. So that's a kind of broader picture. The JCOIN model, I think, is very much reflective of that idea that the person, the successful peer, is the connection that initiates the model. The connection there is fundamentally around role modeling of recovery. And I don't know if you know the Rudolf Muss work that was published in Addiction in 2007 and is in the Addiction Recovery Management book by John Kelly and William White in 2011, where he talks about two fundamental processes: social learning, the kind of Bandura type effect, and social control, about the importance. And for me, the social control is the importance of not just one peer, but the recovery group as the catalyst and determinant of change. And the social control component fits incredibly well with our own work on the social identity model of recovery, which is about the power of the peer network to change the individual's values, beliefs, and perceptions. And it strikes me that one of the things I think that's happened in both the US and the UK is a real fragmentation of peer modelling and peer mentoring and peer coaching, and a lack of adequate evidence base about essential elements around this kind of stuff. So if you were to say to me, how strong is the empirical base around the role of peers? Relatively weak, I would have said. How important is it? Absolutely critical.
Yeah, exactly. That's where we're trying to focus and build that literature if possible. So we may reach out to you for more discussion about this as we're trying to sort of clarify, how to build that literature and where exactly, the gaps are.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that I now do on a Friday morning, which has been one of the most rewarding and valuable things in my work recently, is we've stopped talking about recovery organisations. We now start talking about LEROs, which is lived experience recovery organisations, to expand the definition to family members and people in other forms of trauma. Anyway, I now coordinate a group of people who are chief executives or senior managers of lived experience recovery organisations to provide peer support, but also to manage that process about how peer organisations effectively model innovation, evidence and measure the innovations they do, share ideas and support each other. So in the UK, we did a blog on William White's website last week or the week before, and we had a Recovery College event promoting this. And for me, one of the core questions is not just how do we manage the role of peers, but how do you support peer champions to kind of create that vision and leadership for peer communities, because it's essential. If you think of the third level of capital, that of collective or community capital, it's those visible, successful icons of recovery who create the conditions for social contagion.
Thank you. Very, very helpful.
If you want to pick up that discussion with me outside of this, I'd be absolutely delighted to.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Great. And David, and I would also encourage the linkage facilitator group to continue to think on those kinds of things. We have, I think, 7 studies now that are looking at some variation of linkage facilitator or peer navigator models. And I think thinking about how these issues intersect with that is a really fruitful direction for thinking and contributing to the literature as we do that work. We're going to go to Faye Taxman for the next question.
Hi, David. Very nice presentation. Thank you very much. I wanted to kind of explore with you this importance of positive activities for individuals that you have identified in your research as effective in terms of helping people in recovery, and think about it much more from a desistance or implications for how we could use this in programming, particularly for individuals who are on community supervision. As we all know, the desistance literature is quite also weak and also emerging. But one thing that has happened, I know in the US, and in speaking with Fergus McNeil and some other folks in the UK, community work or community service is not often valued, and it's not often seen as an indicator for justice settings. So I wanted to kind of tap you to see if you had any thoughts on how to build more of this notion about positive activities for clients into programming, primarily for the goals of recovery, but also to seek goals of recidivism. I think you've hit on a topic area that's under researched and undervalued, and I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts about how to move this ahead.
Firstly, it's a real pleasure to meet you, and I am a big fan of your work, and I'm afraid I want to apologise now if I've stolen any of your ideas inadvertently in any of the things I've said.
Oh, that's fine. We're mutual admirers. So.
Excellent. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think this is absolutely critical, and one of the people I work beside at Derby is Stephen Farrell, who's contributed significantly to the desistance literature around, particularly around probation, and notwithstanding the appalling impact of transforming rehabilitation in the UK, which for people who are not aware of this has been effectively a kind of semi-privatisation of probation that really has meant effectively just the erosion of much of valuable probation service. So yeah, Faye, you're absolutely right. You cannot rely, certainly in a UK context, on community service as overseen by the probation service as meaning anything meaningful. And quite often it's stigmatising and negative. And one of the huge challenges we have is around what's called the through the gate challenge of how people who've done well and done useful things in prison then on release are rapidly are back into their old social networks. And I'm sure all of you know that initial window of release is a massively elevated risk for opiate overdose and a whole range of other adverse consequences. One of the things that I'm involved in, a couple of programs, there's a great peer program in the northwest of England called Jobs, Friends and Houses that I've written about quite extensively, which was a program funded by Lancashire Police that was about people with addiction problems in prison being trained up in building trade activities to physically build recovery housing in Blackpool in the northwest of England, to give them non-stigmatising, meaningful roles, to give them something that would contribute to community well-being and that would challenge stigma and exclusion, because they would be walking about the town and city, you know, with hard hats and boots and looking very much like a builder. So the places that they'd done a lot of their crime were not so excluding for them. And there is something, I think, to go back to an earlier question about the self-esteem and dignity of that kind of work and role and getting paid for it. I'm also involved in projects with an organisation called The Well in the north, which is really exciting, which is peer-based projects that go into prison, provide people with pre-release support in prisons, engage them in recovery housing, and provide them with volunteering opportunities. But the real challenge, especially in times of austerity, notwithstanding COVID, is how those pro-social activities become in any way meaningful for people who've got children and families and need a proper job to finance that. So, for me, the work on pathways is starting. I agree with you absolutely that it's absolutely critical that the meaningful activities have some personal resonance in two senses. One, about dealing with some of those pains of desistance issues that Nugent and Schinkel spoke about. And secondly, that they provide those capital strength-based things. They offer that relationship between a positive sense of identity, a sense of personal empowerment and self-efficacy, and a sense of meaning to the work they do, which is why it's no use putting people in call centres the day they're released from prison, because it doesn't offer them those kind of things at all.
Thank you.
We have one more question I'd like us to try to get to. We've only got 3 minutes, and we need a quick recap moment at the end. Mike Dennett, before we go to the next question, though, I do have a very quick question from Mike Dennis. Is there a website with information on the RECCAP on it?
Yes, but I'll have to find the address of it.
Okay, we will follow up, and there's a request for a reference as well, and we'll follow up with that. So I'm going to go to Elizabeth to ask her question, which is the closing question for this session.
It's a lot of pressure. Thanks so much, and thanks, David, for the presentation. Just quick background, I'm an addiction doc, and I work primarily with people experiencing homelessness who often also have criminal legal involvement. And so I think one of the things as you were talking that I just kept thinking about was that so many people that we see actually really do not want to engage within a sort of 12-step for a variety of reasons. And similarly, we've seen that our peers connect really well, our peers who tend to be 12-step oriented really well with folks who sort of enjoy or are open to 12-step sort of approaches. And so my question is just based on the literature, based on what you've seen, are the other sort of social capital, social networks that are not necessarily as focused strictly on recovery, but focused on other pro-social sober behaviors as beneficial? Or do you see really that, and so I guess just sort of overall thoughts on how to work with folks who really do not want to engage in sort of recovery specific social networks?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I would differentiate between 12 steps focused on recovery-oriented social networks. I mean, one of the things in places like Australia and the UK, where there is much more skepticism about 12-step, there tend to be many more diverse recovery groups, local community recovery groups. And I think this is really important to say that, recovery doesn't mean 12-step, and people frequently do use this language interchangeably, and they shouldn't do. And I think one of the key things about recovery community organizations is the idea that you can look at alternative peer-based support systems. And obviously, in terms of the empirical evidence base, and John Kelly and Keith Humphreys have done huge amounts of work, there is a much stronger research evidence base about 12-step. But the notion of engagement with multiple community recovery organizations, I think is growing, and I think it's really important to get that message out there to say, there are many pathways to recovery, and 12-step is just one of them. And none of which, so with things like, I don't know, the Oxford House movement and the smart recovery, therapeutic communities, there are pathways to recovery that don't involve exclusively 12-step approaches.
Thanks so much. I think the other thing we've seen related to Jody's earlier point is just that a lot of 12-step communities aren't necessarily very open to people on medication, which is very relevant to this group in particular today. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's one of those things we have been terrible at as specialist services, is successfully sustaining and engaging people who are graduates of your own program to become peer mentors and peer champions. Who've got, same with prisons. During COVID, in prisons in the Northwest, we've had a fabulously successful time of non-specialist addictions workers, but peers going into prisons and continuing to do work when specialist professionals won't. And so there's an incredibly valuable role for that lived experience recovery movement that's not aligned to a particular philosophy.
Well, thank you so much, David. This has been a really engaging conversation. We can tell by the volume of the questions and the depth of the questions that you've really got people thinking, and this was really a great conversation. I'm going to turn it over, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do this for us. I'm going to turn it over to Lori to go over some housekeeping items for the rest of the day.
Yeah, sure. So just a quick roadmap for the rest of the day. For many of you, the next session starts at 11 o'clock Eastern. We've got 2 breakout sessions coming up. Those are invitation-only sessions because they are working sessions. So attendance is capped on those. Just a heads up, if you are attending either of those sessions, those are Zoom meetings and not webinars, so you will be on camera. So that means now's the time to go get dressed and pretty yourselves up. For everybody else, the next open session starts at 2 o'clock. That's another Zoom webinar with essentially unlimited capacity, and it will be another research session like we had yesterday. So we'll see findings from one of the accelerator supplements, plans for another of the RADX projects, and then 2 presentations on studies in juvenile justice settings that are being supported through the HEAL Prevention Initiative. So that's 11 Eastern for those who are in the breakout sessions, and then otherwise we will see you at 2 o'clock Eastern. So thanks everyone for coming this morning and for your engagement, and thanks again to David, and we will see you down the road, David, and we'll see the rest of you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much. I really enjoyed that, so thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.